Okay, so today is going to be a couple of things. For our wilderness class, it's going to be getting familiar with some equipment that hopefully folks have already at least seen before. And if you are, then you can take this time to do other things. But this is just a kind of a training and skills demo day, more than it is a lab data collection day on, in this case, different kinds of ways to cook food, sterilize water, build a fire. So all of these are sort of managing fuels and spark sources and stuff like that today. Let's start with sort of the most, probably the most industrial. And you guys ever used a canister stove before? These are very, very common for backpacking and mountaineering and stuff like that. Okay. So the idea here is this is a mix of butane and propane, which is at room temperature, or standard temperature and pressure, close to liquid, sort of on the border of gas phase transition. So the idea here is that liquids are about 1,000 times more dense than gases are. So it makes sense to use liquid fuels, but propane is a gas at normal conditions, and butane is, again, right on that thing. So the liquid you see in a lighter, for example, is typically butane. So this is dead dinosaur juice. This is a fossil fuel-based source, and it's the kind of thing that you want to understand is pretty reliable. There are relatively few moving parts in this, relatively few materials that will wear out, like gaskets and washers and seals. So in that case, so for that reason, I typically want to use one of these as my sort of fail-safe backup. In the case that I can't get a proper sort of wilderness style leave no trace fire going, or if that's restricted because of fire restrictions. In some cases, sort of the medium step beyond, sort of halfway to shutting off all capability of all of your visitors to light any kind of a fire in dangerous conditions like we have in California, or up in the Siberian Arctic, or across Australia, or Alaska and the Canadian tundra as it thaws and dries out, burns like crazy. We would expect that, it's a really bad idea to have people building campfires up there, because on a windy day like today, those embers, on a very windy day on the Santa Anas, can travel a couple of miles and hopscotch a wildfire that far, which is insanely difficult to stop. You basically just got to wait for weather conditions to change while you're deploying your stuff. So all of that to say, this is a good technique, but this is trading against our future generations' capability to live the same standard of life that we are. We are deficit spending when we use something like this, so to speak, in terms of climate change and resource use and extraction. So, pretty simple. These are standard threaded. There are a bunch of different brands of these. The Swiss and Germans make them, the Finnish make them, a bunch of different American varieties of them. And these are basically blowtorches. So this is going to create, even with a flame spreader, that's this bell-shaped thing at the top, that's going to give us basically a very tight, concentrated hot spot at the bottom of your pan. So if your pan is anything other than cast iron or copper, which is very good at spreading heat around, all the food that's atop that spot is going to be black and solid and cancerous or carcinogenic, and everything else is going to be undercooked and raw. So you gotta, with this kind of a stove, kind of keep on top of it, stir very carefully. This is also not very big, so when you've got a pot of food and water, or maybe just water if you're just boiling it, you need to understand that it's not particularly hugely stable because it's tall and the footprint at the bottom is not very big. So one of the key concerns of these is that you knock it over when it's doing its thing. And with all standard threaded valves, righty-tighty, to close it and shut it off, lefty loose to open up the throttle and burn some stuff, okay? So there are different formulations of these. The most common is it's an MSR canister, comes in like bright red color, and it's a 3-season mix. And that's a material choice to make because the different fractions of propane versus butane govern the minimum temperature at which this thing will work. As it gets colder outside, the pressure inside of this drops. There's less vapor pressure, less gas trying to get out because it's super hot and pressurized inside. And so on a very, very cold day or setting, especially at low altitude, this stuff is not going to freeze before you do, but it can take a half an hour inside of your clothes warming against your body to warm this up enough to get anything out of it, even if it's halfway full. So just sort of a cold weather technique to think about. So you would assemble it and clear your defensible space of any flammable materials. And especially on windy days like today, but I didn't necessarily grab one. I might have one. You would use a windscreen around it to keep reflecting more and more of that heat back where you want it, into the pot. Okay, so we're setting up on brick in this case, but in any other setting, you'd always put down a ground sheet underneath. This is not going to stop conductive heat transfer. So if you set this up on like a wooden picnic table or a plastic fiber picnic table, like a recycled plastic picnic table, if you have like a spill of fuel onto this and you light it to burn it off, that will still go through and melt or light up what is underneath because it's physically touching. What it will do is, if the flame is up here and radiating some of its heat downward, it's infrared radiation, will bounce that back up into the bottom of the pot exactly how you want it. So you will notice a major improvement in efficiency and a reduction in the amount of calories you got to spend backpacking this around when it's very lossy and you're not using a heat shield.
When you just use like foil?
Yeah, so all this is,
okay.
Yeah, this is a very heavy aluminum foil. So this is like, you can make these yourself for super cheap, or you can just buy them for super cheap. It's just rolled aluminum. It's thicker than like kitchen aluminum foil, but it's not much thicker. So this is about the thickness of like a disposable turkey pan you might get for Thanksgiving to cook. You can just cut it out of that. The edges are pretty sharp though, so watch out for that. These are cheap and mass produced. Alright, so what this is going to do is help us in the case of when we're normally setting it up on soil, not on brick. It's going to help us to keep from sterilizing the soil. So the upper layers of soil are highly biologically active. There's a lot of bacteria and detritivores, small insects and stuff like that. And even a canister stove like this where the flame is, 6 inches off the ground, it's gonna transfer some of that heat downward. Less of it with the heat shield and stuff like that, but even so, over time that can be enough to sterilize that spot in the soil. So when you leave, it still kind of looks the same, but for the next person, after rain has sort of washed that area clean, or with repeated use or what have you, especially in a wilderness area, we don't want these fire scars to keep showing up. So something to keep in mind. All right, so set it up. Grab your first and second, so your primary and your backup spark sources. You don't need a flame for this, you just need the spark. And one last check. This is a pretty open spot, but in particular, do you have anything plastic nearby? So the most common screw up with these is, you get to your campsite for the night, maybe you throw down your pack, you pull out food, and you start cooking and stuff like that. If your pack or your synthetic fiber boots or your knee clad in plastic quick dry clothing, if any of that's too near the flame for too long, it will just melt onto whatever is underneath, and that's really bad. So you would always check for anything meltable nearby. So open it up, listen for the hiss. Spark it, and that's it. It's loud, it's kind of mostly pretty efficient.
How
It'll
long will one of
boil
those
water.
canisters last?
That's a good question. So, making this as efficient as possible kind of boils down, no pun intended, to two things. Pre-cooking your food first. That is soaking stuff like rice and beans in water all day long while you're backpacking along in one of your Nalgene's or your cook prep pot or whatever. And the second is using foil and so forth to make it as efficient as you can. So the other chunk of foil is cylindrical windscreens. So you just sort of roll this out into a circle and I crimp the ends together. So and you set it around the outside, and now, you know, most likely it's going to go up. So to address the question, once you take care of efficiency and your cooking technique to not have to boil the water, then let it soak, and then keep the heat on for 20 minutes at a time to like keep it warm while it's soaking. You can get a solid 4 or 5 day backpacking trip out of one of these if you're being careful about it. They also make bigger ones. They're about this big, like a liter bottle size, bigger. And those will last one person over a week. Yeah. They're not super expensive, they're only a couple of bucks, but these are technically recyclable. Like, you would bring the empty one back to a backpacking gear shop, they send it back to the manufacturer for you, manufacturer pays for the shipping. It says, do not discard this cartridge until empty, and then only in a safe place away from heat. Contact your local recycler for proper recycling procedure. 99% of people are not going to do that. They're going to throw this away. So, we are being super wasteful in this particular application. This is like single-use plastic food packaging here wasteful. So again, this is a good option. It's reliable. Again, very few moving parts. These are not super expensive because they're so simple. But again, we gotta keep in mind everybody else's grandkids when we're making our choices about this stuff. Because we as Americans use 1/4 of the human race's energy, and we're only about 4% of the human race by population size. So we want to acknowledge that and then kind of lead ourselves out of being the worst offender, so to speak, as far as energy efficiency goes. That even boils down to stuff like this. Okay, so the next version is, or next option, is another fossil fuel based option. This is, okay, it's not gonna blow up on you. This is a Whisper Light stove, and this is the international version, so it'll burn kerosene and gas and diesel and whatever other dead dinosaur juice based fuels we like to use other than alcohol. This is a proper, again, that bell-shaped heat spreader. This has baffles in it to spread the flame out sideways before directing it up with the outer baffle. So this provides much more even heat, and it works very well for cooking for like a couple, 3 people at a time in a one-pot meal. That's a lot bigger. This uses exclusively liquid fuel, but the whole point of this stove is to kind of pull this, or the pressurized bottle is going to push the fuel out through the line, and then with this loop here, the liquid gas flows right next to the open burning flame and turns it into gas vapor, which is highly explosive and a really good stove fuel, really efficient stove fuel, very energy dense. But it does mean that we're going to have a slightly longer process than with the gas fuel or the vapor phase fuel, because we got to warm it up and vaporize it and then do it. So we got to prime it and then cook with it. So that's an extra step on the process.
Probably shouldn't smoke while we're
Definitely no smoking. Probably not even vaping. So we got everything we need with this. We need the valve. I may or may not grab one. Let's see if this one has it. Does not. Alright. So we'll have to pause on this one for a sec and grab the other piece of equipment to provide a connection between this and this right here. We'll just lay this one out and come back to it. But the idea here is that this is what we have for summer camp and stuff like that. It's very economical. This is a lot cheaper because you're just buying the gasoline inside, a highly refined version called white gas, versus buying the gas and the metal and the machine fittings over and over with the canister stove. So you get a lot more bang for your buck with this. Hopefully not bang, hopefully nice, safe, quiet cooking. But it's still using the dinosaur juice. Alright, so set this one up. This foil cylinder has a cutout on one side that the fuel line can go through so that you can have this hot pressurized bottle of explosive fluid right next to an open flame, but it stays nice and cool because all the heat's getting directed up and out instead of onto the bottle, which would pressurize it more and potentially cause a situation. You don't want your conversation to turn into a conflagration, as they say maybe in Letterkenny. You have to definitely use your heat shield. Alright, so that setup looks like this. And that works just fine. Alright, but we'll come back to that one once I get the other chunk of the valve. One thing to keep in mind with any of these is when it's very, very cold out and you're having difficulty getting things going, if you have to prime or light the stove and the spark isn't getting it by itself because the fuel is just too cold, the vapor pressure is too low to ignite, then you can use stuff like alcohol, hand sanding gel, which you should have as a backpacker anyway, on hand as a primer. So you just give a squirt of that, in this case, into the priming pan. And that just helps get things lit a little bit more easily in very difficult circumstances. Also, if it's raining cats and dogs and you've got to get hot water going or a heat source going for concerns of pre-hypothermia or something like that, the alcohol will dissolve the water when you have water in a place where you don't want water. And with enough of this, it will bring the concentration of the water low enough that you can light it despite the fact that there being a little bit of water there. So this is the reason why, for example, there are flaming shots. Those shots are not pure alcohol. There's some water content and flavorings and colorants and perfumes and whatever other synthetic nonsense they want to put in their alcohol. But the alcohol will still burn up above a certain percentage of alcohol solvents. Okay, so this is ethanol, the same stuff that'll get you wasted, but it is denatured, so it's got methanol added. So if you try to drink this, it will make you go blind and then kill you. So there's that. That's cheerful. Okay. Moving on. Next option. We have lots of different ways of making campfires, and this is only one of them, so this will be a bit more of a group effort. This is a ground sheet. It's just synthetic waterproof material, and you could use kind of anything for this, a tarp or a heat shield, whatever. And the idea here is that we're going to create kind of a temporary but highly constructed environment for what we would otherwise think of as a regular traditional campfire. So this is one of the ways that Leave No Trace has been applied to making campfires a sustainable option. You can do this over and over in an area, and done right, it's not going to just utterly destroy the area like a regular campfire would, built on just right on the ground and so forth. So the idea here is we put down kind of a tablecloth and then use our boots or full arm tools and build up kind of a dished mound of soil on top of this several inches thick, and then build our fire on top of that, because we know that we're going to destroy that soil, both chemically, because does anybody know what the pH of ash is? Wood ash? Alright, it's very, very high, which means that it's very alkaline, which means the opposite of acidic. It's very basic. So, have you guys heard of potash? Alright, potash is so called because back in the day, it was made from wood ash, and the potassium content in the wood forms, when you add water to it, potassium hydroxide, KOH, which is a very strong base. And it is just as bad for you drinking it or getting any splashed on your skin as a concentrated mineral acid like sulfuric acid or nitric acid, something like that. The only difference being that the potassium hydroxide will burn your skin more than the acid will, the equivalent acid, because it forms a thin film on your skin and keeps burning, versus the acid, which you can just kind of wash off. So, you just mobilize it into water and dilute it until it's done. But with potash, sodium hydroxide or potassium hydroxide, we don't get that luxury. That's really, really rough. So back when the pioneers were making soap by burning wood and then rendering fat and then combining the potash with that rendered fat or oil into soap bars, it worked for cleaning because of the saponification process. It makes suds and dissolves the oils and dirt into the water and you wash everything away. But it also kind of peels off your skin layer by layer. So strong lye soap, as it's called, LYE. Yeah, it was pretty rough stuff on your skin. And then we finally figured out moisturizers at the beginning of the last century. So let's pull out that Rogue hoe over there. So this is not a tool that we typically have in wilderness backpacking. This is big and heavy, and apparently really rusty and dull. But this is a tool that we can use to clear some duff or organic dead down material, get down to subsurface soil and just kind of scrape off a little bit to make what's called a so-called borrow pit. And then make our little truncated sand castle or soil castle right here, build a fire on top of that, kill everything in the soil. We know that's going to happen, but we'll reserve some of the soil that we scrape to mix back in with this before we put it back where we found it, and then recover it with duff material nearby. And we're going to re-inoculate that heat sterilized and maybe chemically sterilized soil from the pH change with a bunch of live bacteria and soil organisms and so forth from the other fraction that we saved and didn't put in the fire. And pretty quickly it becomes functional soil again. Okay? So it's a bit more of a process than just finding some sticks and building the teepee and then building the cabin around the teepee and then lighting it. Lighting a fire so big the gods will notice us again. But this is basically infinitely sustainable as long as not everybody's like scraping like the whole place clean, which we would not expect that to happen in a wilderness area properly managed.
Any concern with that of like melting the sheet?
That's a great question, and I chose the hard mode material, plastic, for specifically that reason, because pretty much all of the thin sheets we're going to have out in a wilderness setting to do something like this are going to be some kind of plastic. So it might be a mylar reflective sheet. That's aluminized plastic, so aluminum to make it real shiny and oxygen impermeable, developed by NASA for space work. And for the rest of us, it's super handy for all kinds of stuff. Silicone impregnated nylon like this. The silicone itself is good to about 500 degrees. Wood fires burn at a minimum of, anybody know? How many degrees Fahrenheit? Kurt Vonnegut book? Fahrenheit 451?
451.
Alright, so that was about burning books and cellulose material in pages. So as long as we have, you know, a couple of inches of soil, which has a bunch of macropores in it, especially as we've broken it apart, it's very airy soil, it's not deeply compacted. Air is a fantastic insulator, second basically only to aerogels and vacuum, like a hard vacuum of space. So we're going to rely on the air mixed in with the soil to basically just take a bunch of that heat and then convectively circulate out of that soil and have cool air coming behind it, and it should be fine. And if we're doing it right, then we can use this thing kind of forever, because it is plastic and this will outlive us if we take good care of it. Great question. Sure. Okay, let's get after it. All right, can I get a volunteer to just kind of head 5 feet in, scrape a little bit of soil? Cool. We're gonna need maybe 1 or 2 gallons. So I'm trying to think of what that would be size-wise.
5-gallon bucket, right?
Yeah, maybe half of that.
Wouldn't you take your cart over the chair in this pattern? Okay.
All right, so for those of you following along at home, we are creating a borrow pit of soil, in this case using a rogue hoe, but anything works. Your hands, your feet, a stick. And we're gonna get a couple of gallons of this. So maybe, I don't know, several pounds worth, several kilograms. And then we'll use that ground sheet to either build the fire on the spot or right next to it. There's no reason that we have to build our fire far away from where we're actually doing the thing. All right, hang on to that. Cool.
I feel kind of weird just standing here filming Brian. Kind of like a creep.
But it makes it look so good, right?
Yeah.
There you go. Okay.
Is that a snake cone?
Oh, that might be. Yeah.
Destroying habitat?
Okay. So, put this on there. And pile the soil right on. So it's several inches thick. Cool. So, for the size of the fire, we increase the thickness. But in particular, for the duration of the fire that we're planning on doing, like if we want this to burn all night long, we really need to make this like a solid 6, 7, 8 inches thick. And count on our soil being really dead underneath the following morning, with that ash mixed in, with the heat sterilization, and so forth. Cool. All right, so as he's working on that and then kind of finishing that up, our next move would be to look at what size chunks of wood for burning on this thing. We want to cut down a tree and section it up into logs and burn the logs.
I mean, if we're following LNT, then we're looking for everything shorter than arm length, right?
Yeah, so forearm length and no thicker than the meaty part of your forearm. We want it to be dead and down so that our fire doesn't have to overcome the sort of cooling and moisture wicking effect of all of the sap in live green wood. So we want mostly cellulosic material, not first year growth, and we want it to be down and ideally nicely seasoned and dried out. I know I'm trying to like shout at you guys, but hopefully the camera's picking it up too. We'll see. We'll see if I have to redub the whole thing. All right. I think that's pretty good. What do you guys think?
I think it's good.
All right, especially enough for a demo fire. So, cool. All right, when we are using long handled tools, we're gonna store those with the business end outside of camp or away and down. So if we put the sharp end up, then we get that Looney Tunes handle to the face move. And if we store it down and away, it's not foolproof, but it's a lot safer. There's no safe. Okay, cool. Next up, we want to assemble the fuel and pile up typically more than we think we will need. We can always broadcast it back into the forest, just winging it back into the forest. But if we have less than we need, then we're setting ourselves up for failure by, at the tail end of our fuel, having to go back into the woods, and maybe it's dark, and maybe it's been raining, and now we're crashing through the woods instead of picking a sustainable path through. So, especially in established campsites, where other folks are going to notice this is a campsite and this is a good spot to look for firewood and make my dinner and stuff like that, it's gonna set us up for making a problem for them. So, leave no trace is to gather as much as you think you will really use, and then use that, and then stop. So maybe we don't need a fire burning for 8 hours every night. Maybe we need enough to get a good solid pile of embers, maybe if we want to cook in the embers, or maybe warm some stones for use, or just to have a redneck TV to look at, you know. But we don't need that for 8 hours, right? We're just going to be chilling around the campfire for a bit, and then we're going to turn in because we're backpacking and we're exhausted and we just walked 20 miles. So, this is a good start. And in addition to fuel, we're going to look for not just the big thick sticks, but everything graded on down to the smallest twigs. And the very smallest twigs are going to help us serve as kindling. So how is kindling different than regular like firewood logs or sticks?
It burns quickly and not for very long.
Yeah, exactly. It's easier to light because we can get a small, well-aerated bundle of kindling up to 450 degrees pretty easily and quickly with just a small lighter or even a spark source. But to get a log or a big thick branch to do that, we're going to need a long, continuous input of at least that much heat to get even like the closest end of it lit. Okay? So, we're not just looking for big sticks. We really want to have a big arsenal of very small twigs that we can use as many as we need to. Now, in the case of days like today when maybe it has just rained or maybe it's just about to rain and you have some concern that your fuel is going to be wet, even though it's just dead down wood and it's dry inside, it's well seasoned, then we can rely on our tree ID skills from forestry to gather some kindling in addition to twigs and sticks. And the wetter it is, the smaller sticks you want to be using. But we can also use, for example, small strips of inner bark, so just outside the cambium layer, just outside the wet sap layer, for specific species where it's easy to peel off small strips of that. And as long as we don't girdle the tree, and as long as we are spreading way far out from our campsite to grab handfuls of that stuff, then we're not creating that so-called releaser cue or social, psychological, behavioral cue of, oh, that's the kindling tree, let me also pull off a stick of that or a strip of that and make my fire with it, in addition to the 500 people in front of me at this campsite previously, and so forth. Okay? So, all that long-winded sermon to say, we need a bunch of wood, typically more than we think we do. We want to be comfortable with the idea of not having to use all of it, because then we've planned poorly and we're going to create additional impacts by gathering a second round of wood. And we're going to get multiple grades or sizes of wood down to the very smallest twigs, which are the easiest to catch. They'll burn very quickly, but if we have other slightly smaller twigs nearby, or bigger twigs nearby, then we can go from tiniest to small to medium to branches and logs, even in a wet environment. Okay? So, let's go find a little bit of dead down wood. Watch out for hangers as you are looking down. So one of those species that can get us.
Do you want me to push the camera down?
No, it's
or-
okay.
Okay.
So one of those species that can get us a little bit of dry kindling even when it's been raining or when it's raining as we are looking. Things like cedar.
Can you pull bark like off of the outside, like this paper and stuff, or do you still want to go inside to the?
That's exactly where we're going. So what we're gonna do is imagine it's just a downpour and we need to get a fire because one of our hiking mates is, pre-hypothermic, not doing well, and we just got to get it done. So you would pull off, this stuff is like real flaky and thin, it's almost papery. You would peel this off, and in the context of a rainstorm, this is gonna be soaking wet. But even like a millimeter or two under that is the lighter colored dry stuff. And that, with maybe a fingernail or a gentle tug or rasp on that, you can gather this stuff and just kind of peel it off in strips. And then you get a big sort of fistful of it over time. And that is really good kindling even in the middle of a rainstorm. This burns really pretty well. So good question. But what that does leave is a trace or a mark. So we want to gather like a strip or two from this tree. And then if we've got one, we've probably got others nearby. So we go to that tree, grab a little bit, not quite a handful. We go to that tree back there, similar bark, and get some from that. And very quickly, we'll have plenty enough. There. What I don't generally advocate gathering for kindling are leaves, which are down and dead and easily combusted, but their shape, their very high surface area to volume ratio or very low density, they're like feathers and they burn, and they fly or can take flight when they burn and create sort of highly mobile embers instead of the embers that are sort of heavy and hot and you want to sort of settle down to the bottom of the fire and keep fueling that exothermic reaction with everything else. Okay, cool. So what we're gonna do is take this mound and stick it in there and make it like, basically, this is called a frustum. This is a cone or like a sandcastle shape with the tip cut off or planed off, and it's slightly sort of dished out in the middle so that when we start creating things like hot embers and so forth, they're not going to want to roll to the outside and melt our super nice and fancy and expensive and sort of fossil fuel based plastics. It's going to roll inward to the middle and create a real hot core for that fire and keep it going and help to completely combust things with less smoke and ash and soot, which is minimum combustion temperature, minimum combustion efficiency, maximum carcinogen washing out into your eyes and so forth. All right, so we want it hot and concentrated. Okay, cool. So let's get some of these smallest sticks, start breaking them down into like 6-8 inch lengths.
Would stuff like this be good for fire starter or no?
You can, so you can use dry grasses as long as fairly comfortable it's not an urticating species, so it doesn't create contact dermatitis on you. And you can use the grasses in particular to bundle sticks together into sheafs.
What about like as far as bringing our own fire starter? Is that something that
Yeah, you can absolutely do that.
have in a plastic bag? I know when we go camping with the boy, I'm a leader for a Boy Scout troop, and we use dryer lint actually, and we soak it with alcohol.
Yeah. Or you can still go wax to recycle a candle, or like a mostly used up candle. All right, so for those of you following along at home, the question is, what about bringing our own fire starter? Yeah, we can absolutely do that. That's totally fine, but you got to carry that, so that's a trade-off decision that you're making with backpacking as a normal entry in the long list of trade-offs that we're making. And In particular with the dryer lint method, we want to think real hard about what are my clothes. If I'm burning this dryer lint, what fraction of my clothing's fibers are plastics? So a cotton polyester blend. Polyester is highly toxic when it burns. Rayon is a synthetic fiber like silk. Acrylics are also synthetic. They're at least eventually biodegradable. But yeah, so if you are like wearing 100% cotton and 100% wool all the time, use that dryer lint. It's free real estate. And if you have any degree of synthetics in your clothing list, then be real careful with burning those synthetics, and in particular breathing the fumes. Okay? Cool. So, there are a couple of different ways to do this next step. How many of you guys and gals have done like the TP and cabin method? Mm-hmm. All right, cool. Let's do it. So, come on in, grab some sticks. I'll build a teepee.
If we have any grasses, we want to feed them.
Exactly.
In terms of LMT, I know this differs in a wilderness scenario, but would you still opt for this scenario if you did come across a pre-established fire?
Or a pre-established fire pit, rather.
Yep. All right, so the question for the video is, in a leave no trace, in a particularly a wilderness setting where you may or may not have established campsites, so pre-existing campsites, whether or not the Forest Service or the Park Service built them, should you use those or should you not? And that is very much on a wilderness compartment by wilderness compartment basis. So in places like Alaska's Denali National Park, it is strictly fully leave no trace. You're not even supposed to be making trails for other people to follow, much less campsites that people come back to. In practice, most people see the landscape and do their route planning the same way. Like, we all want to get up on the ridge line and walk because that's going to be the best views. And farthest away from the grizzly bear quarters down in the washes, for example. But we don't want to commit the easy seductive sin of actually using campsites in that case. Most other places, they'll actually ask you to use the previously used campsites in the wilderness area, because that qualifies as traveling and camping on a durable surface. It's made durable because we've killed everything there. But that's a fair trade-off. That's at least sustainable if it's not leaving any new trace. So there's that. And a lot of that decision is based on how much does fire building present a risk first, and then a nutrient depletion problem second. All right, let's get a nice big packet of kindling together. So some of these long grasses to hold it together. You can get a bunch more cedar or juniper bark, depending on if you're in bush or tree territory, and make a big packet that will be irresistible in terms of lighting this fire. Because if we have like 90% of what we need, then we got to do it twice. So make a big old like fistful.
What do you mean by a packet?
Say again?
What do you mean by a packet?
Oh, so gather a bunch of kindling, and even if you kind of squeeze it together as tight as you can, it's still mostly air by volume. Mm-hmm. So maybe wrap a long grass around the edge just to hold it together for the moment, and it'll sort of fall apart as it burns, but that's fine.
So is that just to make it burn longer? Or?
Yeah, so for example, if you're using, you guys ever use like newsprint to start a fire? So you can like feed it in open sheet by open sheet, and each one just burns like that. Yeah. Or you can twist them into what are basically fire logs, and that's just changing the cellulose to air ratio inside that space. and making it burn longer and eventually burn hotter. So that works out pretty well. That's a great question. Got some kindling gatherers going on. Cool. Pack that entire inner space with it, and that will get us there. All right, so next question with starting a fire like this. Very commonly we'll have some kind of an additional fuel source for our cook stove in addition to the fire, but we want to be real careful about using gasoline as an accelerant, or white gas as an accelerant, to help get this fire up to its sort of sustainable running temperature. So the idea is that gasoline explodes because the fuel itself, the liquid fuel, will burn. With alcohols, you gotta warm them up, and you're only burning the vapor fraction on top, which is how you get flaming shots, right? The alcohol itself in liquid form is not burning, and it will not burn, except in like industrial circumstances where you're pressurizing it like crazy with a pure oxygen environment. But gasoline, that is not the case, right? So if we get a trail of fire from the gasoline to its tank, it will blow up the whole tank because there's plenty of oxygen in there as well. Diesel will not explode, it will burn a little bit longer. So the idea with diesel is that it's a little bit thicker, and it's got a different sort of blend of molecular weight. Alkyl, so straight chain, and benzyl, so ring-based hydrocarbons. And it's a little bit closer to a gel. So in cold environments, you know, diesel can gel, so you use a heater block on your engine to make sure that doesn't happen up in Alaska and in places like Montana. And then neither one of those is a particularly good option, because if we spill it, it's gonna get on our ground sheet and it's gonna trail off past our cleared space, and so on and so forth. And for all these reasons, we wanna, if we have no synthetics, use something like a dryer lint plus wax, or a dryer lint plus oil, or whatever. You know, fire starter, or those like wax and sawdust sticks. You guys have all seen those, like fireplace log starters, that sort of thing.
What about like twine?
Say again?
Twine?
Twine can burn, yeah.
Like the...
As long as it's not like a nylon rope.
pull it apart. Yeah.
But like a sisal or hemp twine, yeah, totally fine. Okay, cool. Well, if we've got our teepee built and we've got our sticks piled nearby for our bigger sticks for the cabin to go around it, then we got the tinder packed in. You think we got enough?
For starters.
All right, there's only one way to find out. Cool. So we grab our ignition source. If you guys would like to, on our field trip, we can also practice so-called primitive living skills, like we can acquire the muscle memory of how long it takes to start a fire with a bow drill and so forth. So when we are, as wilderness rangers, asking our visitors or requiring our visitors to definitely only use stoves and no campfires, or no campfires and no stoves, or fires are okay, each of those has risks and consequences associated with risk getting out of control on that. So we want to understand what it feels like to say to somebody, hey, you cannot take a gasoline stove into the forest. We want to understand what that will push them to do otherwise, because folks are going to try and solve this problem any way that they know how, and everybody knows, at least in concept, what a bow drill is like, but many have not ever actually done it. Same thing with like a flint fire striker or a fire steel, something like that. Much the same idea. So another option that folks have are, like, have you ever seen those magnesium sticks that you pull your pocket knife out? And magnesium is very soft in that particular alloy, so you just kind of shave off some metal shavings and pile those, and then use that to light stuff even when we're wet. Magnesium burns at over 1,000 degrees, so it is going to start something whether it's what they planned on it starting or not. We make fireworks out of magnesium. It's what's a bright white light, and so forth. All right, so who would like to do the honors?
I'm gonna split. Since
Gotta
it's
head out?
close. I gotta head to work. Yeah.
All right, see you later. Anybody else? Yeah. All right. Good luck. Now on the video, keep in mind it is pretty windy right now, which affects things. Better oxygenation, but cooler temperature. Could be tricky. We'll see how it goes.
I feel like I'm on a reality TV.
There you go. Keep your source in there for a bit. All right, so what's burning right now? Just the tinder at the moment. And sometimes we get in a situation where we burn off the tinder and it didn't kind of catch with the sticks. So then we get more tinder and do it again. But we're progressively warming and drying out those sticks, and eventually something catches. This is not, it's not rocket surgery, as they say. Oh, do we need more tinder?
I believe so.
I think we need a lot more tinder. We always need more than we think. So we want to think in terms of big fistfuls of tinder. At least as much total as your two fists together, balled up.
I'm a rocket surgeon.
Okay, so one thing we want to keep in mind is in moments like this when we get a kind of a normal 2-pass go, we don't want to clear out the tinder that's already in there because it's partially combusted, but it's going to act like charcoal. So it's a good carbon source and it will burn and provide a lot of carbon dioxide to the air in the combustion process. And that's a good thing. All right, we need more tinder. Here we go. Also, if you have another class at 2 p.m., it's time. You got to go. Is it dry? Okay.
Hey Tyler. Wanna come build a fire? We haven't successfully started it yet.
You what?
We haven't had a successful start yet.
Wow.
Practice makes perfect.
Should probably get a pile going of extra kindling you can do.
All right. Go ahead and jam it in there as deep as you can. Good. Tyler can attest, having survived, that this specific technique will build a fire.
Yeah. Riding through.
All right, so this is a little bit hard to see on the video. Let me zoom in here and get the fly around. This is absolutely packed on the inside with kindling. So this is the most common issue of pulling the trigger a little bit too early. Instead, this has a much better likelihood of getting going fully because there's a lot more fuel inside instead of open air. All right, looks good.
Ready to go?
Ready to go. Let's get this all
Moment of truth.
in there. I'm gonna pack this in as hard as I can. All right, there we go.
You should have somebody sit on that side so you have like a windshield.
All right, moment of truth.
Shield with your body.
So leave the ladder on and in for a little bit. Let it really catch. Keep it on in the same spot. If it blows out, restart it. Keep going. Don't stop. Okay, we don't have one with us, but another tool that's useful in this moment is it's basically a very long telescoping metal straw called a fire blower, and you put it down at the very base where the kindling is just trying to light, and just over and over you breathe down that tube into it, inspiring fresh air, exhaling into the fire, and that helps get some air down there. That helps work it.
Ooh, we got some sticks catching on fire.
All right. Keep the ladders on it till it's fully entrained. Okay. When the breeze kicks up, you see the embers light up hotter. That's a good clue.
We probably shouldn't take off our masks and blow on it, right?
Well, you don't necessarily have to get your face on there. Tell you what, grab the foil windshield and fold it up into a kind of a fan shape so we can fan the fire instead of blowing on it. After about a minute of blowing on a fire to get it started, feel pretty winded, but you can keep fanning for a long time. For the same reason that instead of screaming for help, you use an emergency whistle. So get upwind of it and accelerate the wind even harder. Yeah, flap as hard as you can. There you go. Good. All right. So we're just starting to get the TP going. Do not stop.
Things getting tired.
Sorry.
All right, now for those of you who are right up against it, does it look like our plastic ground sheet is in any danger of melting?
No.
We're good, yeah. We've done a good job of matching the fire's intensity to the thickness of the soil that we piled up. Okay. Now at this point, the fire is still not truly started, even though our teepee has just started to burn in a couple of spots. At this point, we'd immediately start piling the cabin sticks around that. But since class is over, let's go ahead and extinguish this. So the way that we do that is by cooling it back off. And after all that work of getting it started, right? So the skill transfer is complete. Good job. The next move is to make it safe to put out. So you just kind of pull or kick or push the fire apart, which gets the heat sources farther apart from each other, and we can throw a little bit of loose soil on top, and that pushes the oxygen away from the fire and helps put it out. Okay, so let's do all the above. You want to kind of gently pull the pile apart. All right. Yeah, just throw a bunch of our soil right on top. Not gonna hurt ourselves, not gonna hurt anything. Just like that.
I like controlling things.
Okay. All right. Cool. Now it's still smoking, so there's still a reaction going on, but at this point we just kind of let it cool off and then rebuild our borrow pit with this stuff, cover it with duff, and nobody will even be the wiser.
That's how the Great Fire of Thompson Woods was started.
Yeah.
That is how SIU got shut down for 6 months. No, I'm just kidding.
It's
Okay.
2020. Anything could happen.
All right. All right, so go ahead and clear all the combustible material off of our borrow pit. And where your name right there. And we're just gonna kind of upend this whole thing over onto it. There we go. Looking sharp. Flip it on over. Being very careful. There you go. All right, at this point, you can use your thick sole rubber shoes to kind of
Or your phone.
so like, kick the whole thing out, distribute it, and make sure it's nice and cold again. There's nothing at 450 degrees now. And now we just camouflage it. So how do we make it look like right here? Plants and ground cover. Yeah. Now let's start just piling the duff, dead leaves, some of these sticks, and so forth. There we go. All right. And with a couple of minutes work, it's going to be completely indistinguishable from everything else around here. All right, guys. Cool. So we didn't get to use the Whisper Light stoves for the valve. We just ran out of time. But I'll go ahead and do that with this next crew and include that on the video. Sound good? All right. Nice work.